that the names of Adolf Eichmann and Hannah Arendt should appear together in the title of a paper given at a symposium marking the 50th anniversary of the former famous trial will surely surprise no one. Actually, as Dr. Zertal observed quite accurately, it has become a challenge to think about the Eichmann trial except as it was refracted through Arendt's analytical lens. That such is the case does not mean, of course, that Arendt's insights into what took place in the Jerusalem courtroom 50 years ago are any less controversial now than they were when she first published them in a 5-part series of articles in the New Yorker magazine in February and March in 1963. On the contrary, having recently been labeled a neo-Arendtian by a colleague who took issue with something I said on a different subject altogether, I can testify firsthand that the set of views associated with her name continues to arouse revulsion among serious people. It means only that several of those insights, concerning not only the banality of evil, which is certainly the most memorable phrase associated with Arendt's reportage, but also the nature of the crime of genocide, the judicial treatment it demands, and the lessons properly derived from such treatment, along with her provocative observations on the behavior of the Jewish leadership when faced with systematic mass murder, continue to be engaged, largely with hostility, by all manner of public and academic observers who occupy themselves with such matters today. Now, you will notice that among the issues of which Arendt's analysis of the Eichmann trial continues to provoke discussion, I did not list the third element in the title of this paper, the writing of Jewish history. Indeed, at first glance, it would seem that that theme hardly belongs in the same category with the far weightier problems whose consideration that analysis invites. And yet, the fact of the matter is, as I shall try to prove in the next half hour, that the trial brought to the fore a particular narrative of the history of the Jews and the place of what we have since come to label the Holocaust in it, that had hitherto figured far less prominently in post-Holocaust scholarly accounts of that history. Moreover, I hope to demonstrate 4 additional points. First, that much of Arendt's criticism of the trial stemmed from a rejection of that narrative. Second, that professional historians of the Jews ever since have themselves rejected out of hand what they have often mistakenly taken to be the Arendtian alternative. Third, that they have done so largely for reasons having more to do with personal and communal Jewish commitments than with considered scholarly investigation. And fourth, that preference has ironically helped underwrite a powerful popular view of Jewish history that the professionals profess to oppose. In other words, among its lasting effects, the trial of Adolf Eichmann has exerted and continues to exert a profound influence on the way Jews understand themselves and their place in the world. That's hardly a trivial matter. So I've outlined a tall agenda. Let's get started. The historical narrative that dominated the Eichmann trial was stated succinctly by Chief Prosecutor Gideon Hausner in his opening statement to the court, delivered over the course of 3 full sessions on the 17th and 18th of April, 1961. And I quote, "The history of the Jewish people is steeped in suffering and tears. Pharaoh in Egypt decided to afflict them with their burdens and cast their sons into the river. Haman's decree was to destroy, to slay, and to cause them to perish. Khmelnytsky slaughtered them in multitudes. They were butchered in Petlura's pogroms. Hatred of the Jews, now called anti-Semitism, was not invented by Hitler. It had existed for many generations. Its roots are in the disastrous dispersion of the Jews, in ignorance and prejudice, superstition and envy. But the Nazis converted anti-Semitism into a doctrine of hatred which started with hostility and culminated in murder. It was a spontaneous and irresistible development. He that gave free rein to hatred for the Jews had taken the steep path that plunged down to the day of boycott against the Jews on the 1st of April 1933, to the Kristallnacht pogrom of the 9th and 10th of November 1938, to the physical extermination decision of the 31st of July 1941. This was the logic of events, each of which evolved from the one before and led inevitably to its successors. The way of anti-Semitism led to Auschwitz. Now, the representation of Jewish history as a never-ending vale of tears was hardly new. Indeed, less than 2 weeks before the trial opened, Jews throughout the world had recited the passage from the Passover Haggadah, according to which, quote, in every generation they, that is, everybody else, the nations of the world, try to annihilate us. But curiously enough, that representation had for the most part not yet informed historical descriptions of what only in the wake of the trial would come widely to be called the Holocaust. The first attempt at a comprehensive narration inferred from the documentary record, the book Brevière de la Haine by the French Jewish scholar Léon Poliakov, published in 1951, which appeared in English 3 years later under the title Harvest of Hate, placed the ideological and psychological roots of the catastrophe no earlier than the First World War. In the 1953 book, The Final Solution, The Attempt to Exterminate the Jews of Europe, 1939 to 45, British art historian Gerald Reitlinger presented the Nazi murder campaign as the original creation of Hitler's own imagination, which owed nothing to any longer-term heritage of anti-Jewish images or ideas. Josef Tenenbaum's 1956 Race and Reich placed the seedbed of the Holocaust in European 19th century race theory, which the author explicitly insisted could not be equated with manifestations of quote-unquote anti-Semitism in earlier eras. And the classic Destruction of the European Jews by Raoul Hilberg, which appeared in print just as the Eichmann trial was convening in 1961, while noting that, quote, much of what happened between 1933 and 1945 had already happened before in the history of Jewish-Christian relations, also cautioned that, quote, the destructive path charted in past centuries was an interrupted path, so that some old discoveries had to be made anew, and many a new discovery of the Nazis had not even been fathomed of old. Quote, Hausner's evocation of a continuous, irreversible line of hatred and persecution from Pharaoh to Hitler, as conventional as it may seem today, actually constituted in its time a notable departure from what was then the more common representation of the Holocaust as a historical novum. Arendt had already explicitly negated Hausner's approach a full decade earlier. In her 1951 work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which won her international acclaim and established her reputation as an original and incisive political thinker, she had inveighed against what she called, quote, the doctrine of an eternal anti-Semitism, in which Jew hatred is a normal and natural reaction to which history gives only more or less opportunity, end quote. That doctrine, she warned, again I quote, gives the best possible alibi for all horrors. For if it is true that mankind has insisted on murdering Jews for more than 2,000 years, then Jew killing is a normal and even human occupation, and Jew hatred is justified beyond the need of argument, end quote. Indeed, at the Eichmann trial, Eichmann's lead defense counsel, Robert Servatius, would employ precisely that line in his cross-examination of Salo Baron, the Columbia University historian whom Hausner had put on the stand to explain, quote, what the Nazis destroyed, end quote. Servatius asked him whether all of the evils that had befallen the Jewish people over the centuries were not really the result of some historical providence over which even leaders of great states, let alone bureaucrats like Eichmann, had no control. No wonder then that in Eichmann in Jerusalem, Arendt termed Hausner's opening exposition, quote, bad history and cheap rhetoric, end quote, that would in the end serve to transform Eichmann into, quote, only an innocent executor of some mysteriously foreordained destiny, or for that matter, even of anti-Semitism itself, which perhaps was necessary to blaze the trail of the blood-stained road traveled by this people, end quote. In fact, she argued, Hausner's narrative actually prevented Jews and others from comprehending what exactly had transpired less than 2 decades before. Here are her words. In the eyes of the Jews, the catastrophe that had befallen them under Hitler appeared not as the most recent of crimes, the unprecedented crime of genocide, but as the oldest crime they knew and remembered. This misunderstanding is actually at the root of all the failures and shortcomings of the Jerusalem trial. None of the participants ever arrived at a clear understanding of the actual horror of the past, because it appeared to the prosecution and judges alike as not much more than the most horrible pogrom in Jewish history. They therefore believed that a direct line existed from the early anti-Semitism of the Nazi Party to the Nuremberg laws, and from there to the expulsion of Jews from the Reich, and finally to the gas chambers. Politically and legally, however, these were crimes different not only in degree of seriousness, but in essence. Now, according to Arendt, the essence of the crime for which Eichmann deserved to hang lay in the, quote, attack upon human diversity as such, expressed in a policy of not wanting to share the earth with the Jewish people and the people of a number of other nations, end quote. When the Nazis arrogated to themselves what she called the right to determine who should and who should not inhabit the world, they became, in Arendt's words, not only hostis Judaeorum, that is the enemy of the Jews, but hostis generis humani, the enemy of the human race. Consequently, she insisted that the Holocaust be viewed as, quote, a crime against humanity perpetrated upon the body of the Jewish people, end quote, not as a crime against the Jewish people alone. She thus preferred a master narrative of the Holocaust that focused not upon the tribulations of the victims, like the one Hausner laid before the court, but upon the perpetrator's distinctive universe of discourse, without which the essence of the Nazis' unprecedented crime could not be grasped. But Hausner's narrative embodied a representation not of the Holocaust alone, but of Jewish history as well. It held out the 2 millennia of what he called, quote, the disastrous dispersion of the Jews, end quote, as a time in which Jews had been largely passive objects upon which others had acted out their prejudice, superstition, and envy, not as active agents in shaping their own destiny. In the origins of totalitarianism, Arendt had already dissented from that view, which she had no doubt encountered in much of the Zionist writing she had studied over the previous quarter century. Although she had been careful in that work to insist that, quote, in Nazi Germany the full terror was directed against people with certain common characteristics which were independent of their specific behavior, end quote, she had suggested nevertheless that the accomplishments and failures of European Jewry, especially its elite, during the 2.5 centuries preceding the Nazi rise to power, had helped shape its encounter with the Third Reich to a degree. To her mind, the Holocaust was not inevitable, if only because prior to consolidation of the Nazi regime, it had been possible to prevent the conditions that had permitted it from coming into being. Until that time, she maintained, Jews, and especially their leaders, possessed the ability to influence to at least some degree the manner in which the surrounding society related to them. In that sense, she said, they bore a measure of responsibility as opposed to guilt for their fate during the Nazi era, as they had before. That perception of Jewish agency is what underwrote her infamous and historically dubious charge in Eichmann and Jerusalem that, quote, without their leaders, the Jewish people would have suffered persecution, chaos, and great losses, but it would have been physically impossible to kill 6 million men, women, and children, end quote. That sentence, justifiably, drew considerable criticism. But the criticism concerned itself less with the specific statement's historical validity than with the broader understandings of both Jewish history and the Holocaust that it embodied. After all, most Jews who expressed an opinion about the trial praised it for strengthening morale and solidarity among the Jewish people, for increasing the Jews' collective moral capital, and for helping them come to grips with painful episodes that had troubled them since war's end. Many Jewish leaders appear to have feared that both Arendt's call to set aside the particular Jewish aspects of the Holocaust in favor of its universal ones, and her suggestion that Jews themselves might be implicated in some way in the tragic fate that met them during the Nazi years, were liable to rob Jews of the most significant benefits they had gained from capturing Eichmann and bringing him to trial. As Aryeh Kubovi, chairman of Yad Vashem, the official Israeli Holocaust Memorial Authority, put it, quote, Arendt has done great damage to the climate of guilt, remorse, and repentance that the Jerusalem trial helped create throughout the world, and that is the best guarantee that the barbarism they fear will not recur. Quote. Many historians of the Jews and other Jewish scholars appear to have shared Kubovi's alarm. And over the succeeding half-century, they have sought to obviate it by taking aim at Arendt's larger historical framework. Ernst Akiva Simon, professor of educational philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and a former colleague of German Jewish leader Leo Baeck, about whom Arendt had quite injudiciously observed that, quote, Jews and Gentiles alike looked upon him as the Jewish Führer, end quote, castigated the, quote-unquote, Procrustean structure through which Arendt, quote, tortures the Jewish history of the worst period of persecution, end quote. To his mind, that structure reflected what he labeled, in what is perhaps the earliest recorded use of the term, Arendt's, quote, post-Zionist hostility. This is 1964. Simon's Hebrew University colleague, Yaakov Katz, called Arendt's historical work, quote, pretentious rambling, end quote, and scolded her for allegedly claiming, quote, to have found a predetermined historical law which necessitated the catastrophe, end quote. This was a truly egregious misreading in light of Arendt's consistent insistence that the catastrophe was not inevitable. On this side of the ocean, Ismail Schorsch, then a doctoral student at Columbia University, later chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, saw, quote, the formidable presence of Hannah Arendt, end quote, behind his dissertation, in which he sought, by his own account, to refute, quote, her sweeping indictment of Jewish political obtuseness during the Emancipation era and the Holocaust, end quote. Unlike Simon and Katz, however, Schorsch's determination to attack Arendt appears to have stemmed from an opposite ideological commitment, not to Zionism, but to a liberal integrationist affirmation of diaspora. As he explained in an oft-cited 1976 essay entitled On the History of the Political Judgment of the Jew, an essay that began with an excoriation of Arendt for allegedly spreading the notion that, quote, a 2,000-year condition of powerlessness had atrophied the political capacity of Jews, end quote, and that he later called the epilogue to his dissertation research. He was, quote, bent on challenging the notions that the condition of Jewish powerlessness ended only in 1948, the year of the founding of the State of Israel, or the Jewish political sagacity emerged first in 1897, the year in which the Zionist organization was created. This, even though Arendt herself had never advanced such an argument. Now, the irony is that both positions quickly run aground against the fact that Arendt's view of Jewish history could not be reduced to an entry in the ideological wars between Zionists and their opponents. The contradiction to which the attempted reduction led is most easily observed in Schorsch's 1976 essay. Schorsch identified Arendt with what he took to be the radical Zionist rejection of diaspora as, quote, an endless repetition of oppression, defamation, persecution, and martyrdom, end quote. A position that Arendt actually rejected, as should be clear from what has been said already. Yet at the same time, he took her to task for insisting that, in his words, quote, the victims of the final solution were partly responsible for their fate, end quote. A characterization more accurate than the first, but still grossly oversimplified. Schorsch appears to have preferred a representation of Jewish history that, on the one hand, repudiated, ironically, a la Arendt, Gideon Hausner's depiction of Jews as passive objects of an eternally cruel fate, but on the other, accepted the Holocaust from that repudiation. He appears to have taken the position that only Hausner's depiction could save Jews of the Nazi era from what he evidently regarded as the moral stain of contributing to their own deaths. This conundrum has underwritten what I believe is the dominant trend among historians of the Jews today, to bracket off the Holocaust from the broader currents of Jewish history, and to regard it in much the same terms as witness Yechiel Dinur described it at the Eichmann trial, as, quote, planet Auschwitz, where time was not like it is here on earth, and inhabitants neither lived nor died according to the laws of this world, end quote. For them, the stuff of Jewish history disappeared during the Nazi years and reemerged only in the post-war era. Anyone who doubts this representation is invited to take a ride uptown to the permanent exhibition of the Jewish Museum on Fifth Avenue, where you will see precisely this narrative. Now, I've written extensively about this curious counterintuitive phenomenon elsewhere, so I won't comment on it any further here. Instead, I'll end by noting that this position does not seem to have had much impact in the contemporary Jewish public sphere, in which the most prominent agencies of the Jewish community routinely posit, a la Hausner, an inexorable logic of events that threatens to turn every swastika painted on a New York wall, or, to take a far more serious example, the beating of a Jewish teenager in a Paris suburb, into the first step on the road to new gas chambers. Few historians of the Jews today welcome that situation. Indeed, it suggests, again, a la Hausner, that Jews possess precious little agency in determining the tenor of their relations with their neighbors. Yet the nearly universal castigation of Arendt by historians of the Jews in the wake of Eichmann in Jerusalem, a reproof that persists even today, has had the ironic effect of reinforcing Hausner's stature as a Jewish national hero, and with it the power of the historical narrative he put forth at the trial half a century ago. Now, if historians of the Jews are unhappy with that situation, they might begin to rectify it by re-engaging Hannah Arendt's approach to Jewish history without the ideological pre-commitments and moral ire that have led to so much misunderstanding. Such re-engagement might well offer a useful starting point for figuring out just how the Holocaust fits or doesn't fit in with longer-term themes of Jewish history. And if that makes me a neo-Arendtian, then so be it. Thank you.